Thank you very much, Michelle. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, first of all, and I just want to thank everyone for being here, and I hope we can approach this subject with a lot of sensibility, but also with a lot of openness about the subject of immigrants and refugees, which is a very timely topic and very needed to talk about their deaths, even if it's a very sad situation. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope you can see that now. And well, the title of the presentation is Death Across Borders, how we look at the death of migrants and refugees.
We can see that, so that's good.
Okay, perfect. So with a brief introduction, you can see and hear me, right? I can tell. I just changed to my headphones.
Yes,
I will start with a brief introduction about how the idea for this presentation came about. Then I will go over some key concepts about that, namely biopower and necropolitics. And then I will move to some key concepts about migration. So what are migrants, what are asylum seekers, and what are refugees? And then I will move towards a very timely subject, which is the creation of necro borders, which ties with the first concepts from the second part of this presentation. And then I will go through some case studies and what is being done to address this situation. The idea of this presentation came about after seeing that when it comes to migration, not all deaths are mourned equally, if they are at all. And this becomes evident in the event of mass tragedies. When people are around the world die in great numbers, people grieve them. So when there are natural disasters, a lot of us can empathize with them, can empathize with the families, and grieve these situations. When it comes to the death of migrants, and especially the death of refugees and asylum seekers, that doesn't happen as much. And I think that we can see which lives we consider valuable as a society in our day-to-day conversations on social media, on mass media. We see a flood. We see how this kind of news get flooded with negative comments about their presence in a certain country, in a certain migration route, and they are kind of blamed and re-victimized for their own deaths. And we will see how that's not close to how it should be. I think these conversations are also echoed by state officials for political purposes, of course, but it can always work the other way around. So it can be state officials who influence the perception of the people. And I have this image in the middle, and I don't know if you can recognize what this image is trying to portray, and that's the death of migrant workers who died during the FIFA World Cup in a couple of years ago, and it was one of these events that made me realize that we don't look at the death of migrants as something that should be discussed or that should be that we should claim for justice, right? There were several attempts to stop the World Cup due to all these deaths that happened during the construction of the stadiums and the infrastructure for the World Cup, but they didn't really amount to anything. People still watch the games, and they didn't consider the deaths of these people. So I will move over some key concepts about that, and I will look at how life and death are controlled by those in power. And that sounds admittedly very conspiracy theorist of me, but we will see how these concepts do have some. We do have evidence of these concepts playing out in the real world. So I will start very briefly with the concept of biopower, which is the intersection of political power and life itself. So when we talk about biopower, that's a concept coined by Michel Foucault. And he says that modern power fosters life or disallows it to the point of death. So previously, during the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance, you will have a sovereign, right, a king, and he will be allowed to say who lives, who dies. The people who died will be executed. That doesn't happen anymore. What happens is that we have people in power who foster life um, through the control of biological processes like birth rates and life expectancy. And this sounds very beneficial at first. They improve health, they improve roads, they build infrastructure for people to be able to live and thrive. But they can also take it away, or they can take it away from some populations, and essentially they disallow them from their right to live to the point of death, even if they don't kill them. We are talking about slow deaths where people are not able to thrive in life. Achille Abembe, another theorist and an academic, thought that the focus on life was not all the story, and he says that political power determines who lives and who is exposed to death, and it subjugates life to the power of death by instilling a fear of death, which we all here are familiar with. And it does so by creating direct violence, death, neglect, or dead worlds, which are environments where populations are exposed to life-threatening conditions, resources are scarce, and the lives are deemed disposable. Some examples are the way that states control abortion rights. So that doesn't mean that abortion is going to stop. That only means, as we know, that people are going to die by getting abortions or by not being able to access reproductive rights. We also saw that in the response to Hurricane Katrina, which is a picture below, and that was a way that the government neglected certain populations, in specifically Black neighborhoods, and they died not so much from the hurricane itself, but by the neglect that they have experienced. So here we can see that when we talk about necropolitics, we talk about the politics of disposability that tells us that some people are disposable and that some deaths are allowable, and that they are permitted by those in power to happen. And again, this brings back the example at the beginning of this presentation, and also the use of sweatshops, not only in the global south, but also in the global north, where mostly migrant workers are expected to live in these dead world situations, where they either live in conditions of misery or they die when accidents happen. Some key concepts about migration. It is important to remember that when we talk about human mobility, not all humans move from one place to another equally. When we talk about, we have two umbrella terms, which is that of a migrant, who is someone who changes his or her country of usual residence, irrespective of the reason or legal status. For education, work, for pleasure. It doesn't matter the time frame. It could be 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, or for the rest of their lives. And it doesn't matter if they are undocumented or documented. They are migrants. They move from one country to another. We also have forcibly displaced people. Well, it's important, before I go to forcibly displaced people, I'm sorry. It's important to remember that when we see news about migrants on the news, it's mostly migrant workers, right? It's either they're coming here illegally, or there is some sort of tragedy that happened that puts them at the forefront of our attention. And I just want to stress that migrants and migrant workers are protected by certain human rights. So I won't go through the list, but it's important to remember that it doesn't matter whether they're documented or documented. They have fundamental rights, and it is they should be protected by the national legislation of their receiving states, so the places where they come to. And this doesn't often happen, and we have many instances where migrant workers, especially, are subjected to conditions, to subhuman conditions, we could call them. Here we have the testimony of a Mozambican worker working on a construction site, and he says that the environment left much to be desired. They were working in a place that had no regulated safety at all. There was no order, he says, no safety inspectors were on site. And here we start to see how these dead worms do exist. There are places where death is almost accepted for certain individuals. This doesn't happen, or this shouldn't happen to nationals, so it shouldn't happen to migrants either. Here we have another example of how the states exercise the power or the necro power, not only through direct violence or through the construction of these dead worlds, but also symbolically. This is a headline from back in April, I think, and it says Trump administration lists thousands of living immigrants as dead to prompt them to leave. So he was trying to cancel the social security numbers, which were legally obtained. These were people who were not that that's an excuse, but these were people who were legally in the country. They had been legally accepted by the Biden administration, and what he was doing was rendering them dead, right? So they were living dead in a sense. And what this means is that they were they were forced into a condition of social exclusion where they couldn't partake of the economic life, for example. They couldn't take money from banks. And this was obviously pushing them to leave the United States and go back to the countries where we have to remember a lot of these people wouldn't have a social network to fall into. And this will also render them living dead in the sense that they don't have a social blanket or social security for them to thrive in life. Obviously, ICE disappearances are also another example of how people, migrants, are rendered into dead people basically by being forcibly disappeared. When people don't have access to the legal rights, to legal support, to have contact with the family, they are essentially put in a state of death, where they are not able to thrive, they are not able to make decisions for themselves. Obviously, they are not able to make decisions for the family members, so this deprives them of liberty and puts them at risk of obviously death or being disappeared forever without giving some kind of comfort to the families of knowing where they are. Now we move to forcibly displaced people, who are people who have been displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or human rights violation. There are currently 117 million forcibly disappeared people worldwide. And just to put that into perspective, there were around only just over 100, I think it was 103 million people when the Ukrainian invasion started. So we can see that these are numbers that are rapidly increasing, and these are this is a concern that we need to address. Forcibly displaced people are also divided into several categories. There are those who are internally displaced, so that means that they don't cross a border; they're displaced within their own countries. There are refugees who are those people who are recognized as such and are currently receiving legal protection as refugees. Asylum seekers are those who are in the process of obtaining legal protection and thus become refugees. And I think that's it's important to keep that in mind. Just to understand a little bit about the legal framework behind the recognition of refugees. This started post World War II when Jewish and non-Jewish refugees were being denied entry to other places. They were fleeing persecution across Europe, and they were being denied entry by many of the states involved. And so the newly created United Nations had to create a refugee convention that will basically force states to protect these individuals. The refugee convention describes a refugee as someone who is unable or unwilling to return to the country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, such as being LGBT, such as being women, for example, or political opinion. It is important to remember that refugees shall not be penalized solely by reason of unlawful entry or because being in need of refuge and protection, they remain illegally in a country. So I think there's a misconception with people that think that refugees are illegal individuals, so they're being they are involved in illegal activities just by being in a country or just by asking permission to be in a country, and that couldn't be further from the truth. They are indeed they indeed have a right to international protection, and they shouldn't be allowed to enter another country to seek asylum. And this is important because especially when they try to cross a border or when we see news of people trying to cross a border or to cross the sea, to cross the English Channel, um, the government and the people believe that they should be pushed back, that they should be returned to the countries of origin so they can begin a quote unquote legal process. But that's again not true. They should be allowed. They should be allowed entry, and they should be allowed an interview to determine whether they can claim refugee protection or not. And according to the principle of non-refoulement, individuals cannot be returned to a country where they will be at risk of irreparable harm. Now, these were protections for those again in 1951 who had experienced World War II and who were living in Europe. In 1967, there's a protocol who liberalizes this refugee convention and makes it available for everyone in and outside of Europe and within any time frame, not only for those but the World War II time frame. So that makes this refugee protection available for everyone. So what now? What has happened if we have all this legal framework that protects refugees and that the population should agree with, right? Like we should know this and we should actually enforce our own governments, our own states to abide by these conventions and international laws. What happened? So that's basically the widespread of anti-immigration sentiments, and as we will see, the creation of necro borders, which ties with the concepts that we saw at the beginning of this presentation, And when we talk about necro borders, we mean sites where states not only let live or die, as Foucault or Mbembe argued, but where tactics are used to make death premature. So if we remember what, according to Jean Mbembe, the ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. And in this sense, the border becomes the central apparatus through which states exercise necro power. Here I have a quote from Tamara Lass, who defines border deaths or includes certain border deaths into this definition. We're talking about shipwrecks, people dying from dehydration, hypothermia in boats or in rural or wild areas, instances of direct violence or indirect violence, such as people shooting on them, even border agents shooting at migrants, or the use of landmines. So nowadays we see a lot of militarization of borders, a lot of the building of a lot of new barriers. I think it's interesting to see how nowadays, at the time when the Berlin Wall fell, for example, there were around 20 border walls around the world. Now we have more than 70. So we see that there's a prevalent use of these deterrence tactics to prevent people from coming into a certain country, from crossing a border. But we know that border policies that emphasize prevention through deterrence lead to migrants into even more lethal areas, turning these sites into killing fields. So that's an example of how states construct necro borders by making these sites places where death is going to happen, because we know that people are not going to keep coming in, and we have evidence for that. That's just these tactics just force them to go into more isolated places where they will die, or there will be a risk of death. We have this headline from a couple of years ago, when 51 migrants died inside a truck, or two trucks, I think it was. And of course, if we look at the policies at the time, where there was increased rejection of migrants at the border, and migrants who were trying to go through the legal process, we can see how these people were desperate enough to come into the country, where they unfortunately die. And we have this quote where, again, we need to emphasize that no immigration deterrence policy will greatly reduce migration, and do so without killing human beings. And so the question is not whether countries have a legitimate interest in having some form of migration control, but rather whether those interests justify policies that cause mass death. We have another example. There was this news, this happened at the same time, I think it was 2023, where a fishing trawler capsized in international waters. Only 100 people were rescued, and it was believed that 650 migrants perished with the sinking ship. When this reached the headlines, it was believed that they had just died. The boat had just capsized by itself. I think it was later found that there had been attempts from the people to call Greek authorities where this happened, to be rescued, to be given aid, but they were ignored. In many of the cases, when we see boats trying to cross international waters, there are pushbacks. So the states try to push them back and not allow them entry. And this is what causes these boats to capsize in the first place. it's the interference of states which puts them at risk and kills them essentially. And this is interesting if we compare that with something that happened right about the same time, which was if we remember the missing OceanGate submersible, this submarine type of vessel that got lost trying to reach the Titanic. And there were multiple rescue efforts from people all over the place. I think Canada was involved, and a lot of other countries, and I'm actually not sure which. But we can see how governments will pay attention to certain people over others. And not only will migrants, for example, be ignored, but they will be put at risk by their policies and the tactics they use. We have several case studies. I will try to go quickly for them. And first, I wanted to pay attention to this headline. This was right around the time of the Ukrainian invasion, and this was something that I saw commented a lot of the time, that the pets of refugees were being allowed in, which is in and of itself very laudable, very commendable of Polish authorities to allow this. This happened at the Polish border, by the way. Um, they were allowed safety. Their lives were deemed worthy enough to be safe and to be protected. And we can compare that to the treatment of of asylum seekers who were also at the time in the Polish Belarus border, and they were being denied entry, and they are still being denied entry still nowadays. And there were it's just heartbreaking to see how human lives, children, women, old people were not deemed as worthy as pets, right? And I think it's not a matter of saying pets are not important. That's obviously not my intention here. But I think it is there is something wrong when the lives of pets are talked about and not those of children. And it's important to see that it was not only the government, but it was people who were pushing these tactics, or at least they were normalizing them, in the sense that I was living in Poland at the time. So if you talk with people, with random people about the subject, they thought that the Polish government had a right not only to deny these people, which, as we saw, it's incorrect. There's international protections in place, um, but but people had the idea that the Polish government had a right to kill them, right, to exercise direct violence on them. And again, that's not true. Now, when we talk about migrants, we can see in headlines that there's almost like a mourning hierarchy where children have the more right to be mourned over women, over elderly people, over especially over men, over young men. Then we also have women who will get more empathy from people on the internet or even from government officials, but that's often not always the case. And then we have elderly people who will also be given more empathy. Um, but but as we will see, that's not always the case. Here we have some examples of how the deaths of children and women are always the emphasis of this news, and that always relegates men to justifiable deaths almost, I think. This is from a headline from a couple of years ago too, and these are still the headlines today, where it is the deaths of children and women who are the focus. I'm sorry. And But even when we talk about women, that's not always the case, and people will be re-victimized through discourses that perpetuate the normalization of refugee deaths, implying people on the move are fully responsible for their own deaths. This despite the proven impact of harsher immigration policies on people, border violence, and the refusal from governments to provide aid when people are in distress. This is a tweet from also a couple of years ago, where people were protesting the deaths of migrants that had died, but people are quick to say, like, well, the mothers of these people shouldn't be grieving, or they shouldn't be encouraged to grieve or to protest because they were the ones encouraging their children, or funding their children to embark on those dangerous journeys. And again, I think there is a lack of humanity in these kind of discourses that is not only said or reflected by state authorities, but it's also echoed by the general population. We see that the unlawful denial of aid, especially during the criminalization of people who arrive on small boats, not only to the UK, but this is an example that I have here. Also puts civilians, also puts a lot of responsibility on civilians to actually act in aid of these people. So when the states fail to provide any kind of aid during emergencies, that places the burden of that on NGOs, civic organizations, and unprepared citizens. This is also a quote, a headline from a couple of years ago, when people started to appear, well, dead corpses started to appear on beaches after a boat had capsized, and normal people experience this traumatic situations where they see mothers snatching children, or they see people trying to save themselves. They see people coming into their homes already dead, coming to the beaches already dead. There's another example from the Polish Belarus border, where the Polish authorities have absented themselves from responsibility, and
Paulina,
this had caused. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just we've got 10 minutes left before we need to close. I don't know how close you are to finishing. We don't currently have any questions, but if people did want to ask anything, I don't know how much longer you have.
Yeah, I'll be done in 2 minutes, I think.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. This puts random workers, as in this example, in contact with these dead people, and as you can imagine, that's a very traumatic experience for anyone to encounter. So what's been done is essentially civilian efforts to provide final rights. Here we see activists singing funeral songs. That happened a couple of years ago. This keeps happening. There's a more recent picture, I think from 2024, where still civilians are in charge of disposing of the dead at the Polish Belarus border. From El Hierro in Spain, where it is also civilians who are giving funerals to migrants, even when they are not recognized or the immigrant. We have a couple. I won't go too much into this, but these are a couple of resources where you can see the attempt of organizations to document and memorialize those who had died, even when they remain unknown. Here's a list. Here's a map of deaths, of migrant deaths across the U.S.-Mexican border. There is also several groups who are trying to go into what they describe as border criminology, or the criminology of mobility. That is in Australia. And finally, just to conclude, I believe that a debt positive movement that advocates for everybody's right to autonomous debt related decisions should also stand behind the rights of migrants and refugees, and the right to lead a dignified life, which in turn leads to a dignified death. And I think we should all advocate for, while we advocate for the normalization of death and dying, we must understand that some deaths, especially these deaths of migrants and refugees, are avoidable. And people on the move are unable to decide over their or their loved ones' remains and memorials, and also how they are portrayed by the media and by state officials, which strips them of their humanity and re-victimizes them even after life, or after the end of life. I believe that with a quickly increasing refugee population worldwide, we must begin to question our governments and their inhuman migration policies. So that would be the end of my presentation.